Thank you for all these welcoming words. I won't take the time to repeat all the names of the people who have welcomed us, but it's a true pleasure to hear you also appreciating the social scientists and fundamental research and curiosity-driven long-term research in this area. And we hope that you will leave this room and be even more convinced that this is important for the betterment of Sweden and the world. So it's my great pleasure now to introduce to you the first keynote speaker of today. And our first keynote speaker is Della Porta. She's a professor of political science and dean of the Institute for Humanities and the Social Sciences at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, Italy. There she also is the director of Cosmos, the Center of Social Movement Studies. It is precisely the study of social movement that is her field of expertise. She has worked on the connection between civil society, political violence, policing, and mobilization in relation to democracy. She's the winner of the Mattei Dogan Prize for her work in political sociology, and she recently directed a major ERC study on democratization in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, and in Latin America. Her latest book is called Can Democracy Be Saved? So, welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be able to present some of my research related with the ERC fundings on democratizations. And the book I draw some ideas from is called Where Did the Revolution Go? I did the research while I was a professor at the European University Institute, and I finished it at the Scuola Normale Superiore, where I'm now. And I guess that's in the distinction between the bright and the dark side of democracy. I will talk more on the bright side, but also on some shadows and storms, to keep with the climatic metaphor. And what I want to address is the questions of what happens after transitions to democracy happens, what happens when we see that the squares which are often full of people claiming and asking for democracies, then are emptied out. And sometimes what we see is that the promises of democracies are not really considered as fulfilled, that the hopes that the democratization protest, the protest for democratizations had risen, are not fully met by what happens later on. And my claim is that in order to explain why people disappear from the squares, we have different paths that we can look at and different type of explanations. But what is important is also not to forget that these moments are particularly important for the development of democracies later on. So my research has been focusing on two main waves of democratizations, 1989, Central Eastern Europe, and the so-called Velvet Revolutions, peaceful changes towards democratization, and 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, which was less successful to a certain extent, but in which also the type of dynamics were very often people in the streets for a few weeks, a few months, and then the development of democratic representative institutions, which less qualities of democracies and people not so satisfied, let's say. And my claim is that if we want to understand the reasons why these bright moments are sometimes followed by shadows. We have also to look at the characteristics of the moments in which democratization happens and the type of timing, conceptions of timings that's developed in this moment, and address some important questions for political science and sociology, as well as for those who think in terms of effects of democracies. And this is related especially with the type of legacies and memories that these critical junctures, important moment bring about. And the main question is what happened, how do we adjust our sociological lenses when we look at different times, when we look at the exciting, intense times of transitions to democracies, and then we move towards a normalized times in which enthusiasm, expectations tend to be put asleep. So research which I've done have been using several type of methods. We have collected information about the type of protest events and the timing of this protest. We have been interviewing former activists, sometimes shortly after the events, in the case of the Arab Springs, sometime after decades, in the case of Central Eastern Europe. And I've been looking at documents in order to understand the dynamics of democratizations and what happened. Title of the book, Where Did the Revolution Go? What happens when we don't see any longer people in the street? And the sociological questions which is often asked is, how does it happen that sometimes the speed of the events tend to become faster and faster? How does it happen that sometimes we have a condensation in time? And what we saw, in fact, through an analysis of the protest events is sudden increase of attention of people who are considered usually as passive, especially in authoritarian regimes, sudden attentions to issues of freedoms which have been mentioned, and of issues of democracies, social justice, and so on. So how does it happen that there are very fast increase in the participation of people, peaks in protest, which happen in all the cases I've analyzed, and which are characterized very often by sudden increase in the number of events, but also, for instance, case of Czechoslovakia, by the presence of a huge number of people in the streets. And so the question is, what pushes people who were afraid of repressions in authoritarian regimes suddenly to become convinced that they can put at risk their own life in order to achieve a public good like democracies. And this is Czechoslovakia, GDR, suddenly increase in numbers of events and participation in the protest. What is often the impressions of scholars, the public, politicians about this type of events is that these events are unexpected. All the wave of democratizations has been characterized by a lack of predictions. In Central Eastern Europe, even the leaders of the democratic revolutions thought that there was still a long time to go. In Egypt, nobody would have expected that the small demonstrations which was planned before the occupations of Tahrir squares was going to produce the big turnouts and the revolutions and the defeat of the dictators. Why a scholar called Kuran asked himself after 1989, why, if the revolutions was inevitable, it was not foreseen? Why did people overlook signs that are clearly visible after the fact? And in social sciences, we often think in terms of critical junctures, moment in which the type of expectations of people and the type of motivations of people tend to change quite suddenly. Protest events tend to cluster in times, in waves, in cycles. What does produce these cycles and what produces instead then the return to normality, which is what I was trying to explain with my own research. Scholars that studied the breakdown of the Soviet Union, Basinger, said that events and the contention of identity which they represent are not distributed randomly over time and space, but their appearance is structured both from the temporal and from the spatial point of view. So we have mobilizations of the civil society which goes in chains, series, waves, cycles and tides. They condense. And I think it is important, if we want to reflect in terms of what produces democracies, but also the shadows later on, to how some events which appear suddenly, like some important protests that trigger transformations, affect both the ways in which individual things and the way in which systems react. So at the micro level, usually in authoritarian regimes, you have fear that fear of repressions, which pushes people not to express preferences for democracies and to adapt to the situations. But suddenly, sometimes events that focus attentions of the people, like the ones we had in 1989 in Eastern Europe or during the Arab Spring, produce what scholars consider the transformations in their preferences. There is big demonstrations produce what in the social science has been called signals, in signaling theories. That's something important is happening, and that your own private preferences for democracies, for freedoms, and so on, are in reality widespread. So at the micro level, the participations, events which are triggering participations of people are important in transforming the perspective of individuals. Individuals, if we look at reports on these events, tend to transform their own way of looking at things. They start to think that participating in big protests challenging dictatorships is most important for their own type of life, that they could not stand the historical events without participating in them. But there is also another type of transformations which is more in related with the macro level. Scholars of democratizations like Guillermo O'Donnell and Philip Schmidt have suggested that transitions from authoritarian rule are illustrations of underdetermined social change, large-scale type of transformations which occur when there are insufficient structural or behavioral parameters to guide and predict the outcome. So usually in normal times, people adapt to expectations about how normal rules tend to determine, to structure behaviors. When some events, like the protest I was talking about, develop, they have one of the main effect is that they transforms the expectations of main actors. So the military is an important actor in democratizations. In normal times, the military knows how to repress protest, but when the protests increase in numbers and in intensity, the positions of main actors tend to be transformed. And at the meso level, at the level of the type of actors that intervene in this process, you have a sort of development of eventful type of protest. So they are events which are not necessarily historically central, not unique in history, but they produce effects on those who participate. So these moments are transforming individuals and they are transforming the environment. So protests are not only instrumental, but they also help empowering individuals, producing identifications, transforming arenas of solidarity. And they act through the development of relational, cognitive, and affective type of links. So this is, I think, a path which we found out in most of the process of democratizations which I've studied. But what I saw was that there were also important differences between two different paths of democratizations. And these are summarized in this table. Transitions to democracies are what political scientists defined as critical junctures. They transform the rules of the games. They transform the conceptions of politics at individual and meso level. And they tend to be path dependency in the sense that they tend to introduce element of continuities. Usually, political scientists have distinguished two main paths towards democratizations. Democratizations by pact, which has been considered as a main and more physiological type of forms, and democratizations by rupture, the breaking down of regimes rather than the development of pacts and agreements. What I saw, looking especially from the point of view of the participations of the civil societies, was that there was a form of participations which was oriented towards these ruptures, which was quite disruptive. I called it eventful type of democratization. So, for instance, the case of Czechoslovakia, or the case of the GDR, or the cases of Egypt or Tunisia, were cases in which civil society participate very actively, promoted democratization processes. There were other type of paths which were instead what I called participated pacts, in which democratizations developed more from agreements. And I saw that this type of paths had an influence also later on. And that these influences were produced by the ways in which some mechanisms of protest were then embedded in the emerging type of institutions. And to this extent, my own evidence tend to meet some research on first path of democratizations. For instance, Barrington Moore research and historical sociological approaches, which says if we want to explain democratizations in the first waves of democratizations, we have to look at the social structures of societies, but also at the important agencies, the important moments of revolutionary ruptures. So Barrington Moore was explaining democratization processes in Europe in countries like France or the UK. in which revolutions were real revolutions. But I think that nowadays, this element of a rupture, this element of discontinuities, is an important and positive element in the development of institutions later on. So that countries that proceeded through a moment of disruptions were able to reconstitute democratic institutions which functions better than in countries in which compromise prevailed. And to look at this type of, try to find out reasons why this happens, I looked at the cognitive, emotional, and relational shift that were produced during this intense moment. As I mentioned, these moments were short. They were, if we think about the Central Eastern Europe, it was a few months of protest in the GDR. It was a few weeks of protest in the Czech Republic. But they were intense moments in which organizations were created, participatory forms of democracies were set up, and people tended to legitimate participation from below. So my research was also oriented to look at the outcomes of this type of protest, and there is a lot of research on what is called the quality of democracies. And I took some of this research in order to address the questions of how transitions to democracy, this moment of transitions, tend to produce long-lasting effect on the ways in which civil rights, social rights, and political rights are set up. And I singled out some mechanisms also on the outcome side. Moment of transitions are moments which ends up with constitutionalizations of rights. And countries which went through transitions which was very much pushed from below, from civil societies, were those in which constitutions reflected these demands of participations from below, allowing for a larger forms of participations. Also, countries in which there was large participations were countries in which those rights which were mentioned in the beginning of this morning's welcoming presentations, rights, social rights, were also more widespread. And these were cases in which democracies was not conceived only as electoral institutions, was not considered only as the moment in which people can vote and then return to normal life, but they were conceived also as institutions that were to take care of freedom, but also to take care of justice. And the social dimensions was extremely important. And in the last, I think, 10 minutes of my presentation, what I wanted to look at is this dynamic of time intensifications, which is so important for the transitions of democracies in the path which I identified as eventful transitions, but which I think are also important in democratic countries, in moment of crisis, and in introducing in transforming the challenges of a crisis into an opportunities for changes. So nowadays, for instance, in democratic countries, there is the big challenge coming from austerity policies, economic crisis, increasing inequalities, and the ways in which the civil societies organize and react to this, I think, is extremely important in order to set up potential and empower citizens and set up potential solutions. For this type of developments, I think, for transforming dark sides of democratizations into bright sides of democratization. What one needs is also some element of agencies, some elements of transformations of the structures. Traditionally, in the social sciences, we are accustomed to think in terms of structures which constrain actions. And the moments of crisis are the moments in which there are less hope for positive type of transformations. But what we have seen through research on social movements and the civil societies is that sometimes moments of challenges, like the moment of a financial crisis in Southern Europe, are also moments in which solidarity is triggered. In which resilience happens, in which citizens organized more with an orientation towards the public good. Moment in which people tend to be less egoistic and more altruistic in their sort of expectations and behaviors. And these are moments which I think we cannot explain if we look just at the type of structures which are constraining actions, but we have to see also its, say, conjunctural event, capacity of individuals and groups to react to structures, eventful moment in the sense that events transforms the structures rather than being influenced through them. And I see this moment as moment of time intensifications, as I mentioned, transitions, but also moment of perceived crisis of existing structures, which are moments in which networks are produced, so relations are intensified. Movements for democracies are movements that develop in free spaces, develop the image that we have of the transitions to democracies in countries like the Czech Republic or Tunisia are full of images of squares, full of people that meet each other, diverse type of people, what was mentioned in our own research. So organizations are produced, formal and informal, ties are created. The very need to organize, introduce elements of encounters between different types of peoples. There is a sort of fluidification of borders. Structures in this moment of intense time are no longer able to constrain individuals. The army, the dictators are no longer considered as those who are able to impose rules, but structures tend to fluidify. Actors, the so-called poderes facticos, the factual power of dictators, tend to disalign themselves. And these events are not following structural constraints, but rather challenging the type of constraints. And at the micro level, there is a transformations in the very identities of the individuals. So what I want to suggest is that if we want to look at the dark and bright side of democracy, we need to look at and take into account these important moments of intensifications of times, of transformations of times, in which preferences, identities, structures are produced. And in my own research, what emerged as important factors that tend to have consequences in the long terms are, on the one hand, legal legacies. These are moments in which institutions are created, laws are created, structures are created, but also memories. memories which are mobilized, particularly in moment of crisis, memories of the creation of public goods, memories of the creations of collective identities, and so on. Just in 1 minute, a word about why I think that this is important also in terms of concrete consequences. We were watching all the important contributions that hard sciences give to our own life, quality of life, and so on. But what we know is that political events are fundamentally important also for the development of those freedoms and basic social equalities, which are so important for the development of sciences in general, of the social sciences and of other sciences. And so I think that especially in a moment in which freedoms and justice are so challenged, in which so many scholars of most disciplines are at risk in authoritarian regimes, that reflecting on the issues of democratizations is important not only for the social sciences, but in general for science and progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us and proving the importance of events, which is interesting at an event such as this. So we have asked 2 doctoral students from Uppsala University to prepare comments and questions. So I would like to start by asking Sebastian Reyes Molina to ask questions and comments.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank Professor Della Porta for her presentation. It has been very stimulating and interesting. I would like to ask 3 questions. And I would like to focus on the first part of your presentation in which you were saying, well, where are all these social movements, the grassroots movements, go after the new regime or new democratic regime is installed. So I take you to be saying that there is a paradox, let's call it the grassroots paradox, and it holds that the grassroots movements that start revolutionary processes vanish from the political stage once the new democratic regime is installed. The paradox seems to suggest that at least in one aspect there is an event that sparks the outrage of the population, and therefore leads to the breaking away from the undemocratic status quo. But once the regime is overthrown, the grassroots movement is not part of the new regime, and hence we say that it fades away. So if that is the case, I would like to ask you 2 questions regarding this particular point. Are there mechanisms inherent to democracy that hinders grassroots movements from participating in this new democratic government? And if so, the second question, would you say that these mechanisms can be found only in a model of representative democracy, or can we find them in other models of too? So one example or thing that I have in mind is the know-how of political ruling classes. So it seems that once democracy is achieved, it is necessary a certain degree of political literacy. Politicians that usually they are from some elite portion of society know the inside workings of the clockwork, if you like. This type of knowledge tends not to be available for the people that they belongs to the grassroots movements. Thus, they change one authority for another, but the exclusion holds nonetheless. So with this in mind, it's like it's inevitable to think on Lampedusa's insights in the Gato Pardo, right? Change everything so everything remains the same. And a third question that I would like to ask is like this past couple of years, some authors have claimed that folk politics or grassroots movement protests are some sort of just window dressing. That civil discontent is being channelized through massive protests, but nonetheless authorities seems to give them little importance. For instance, books like Inventing the Future by Zniszek and Williams from 2015, or Assembly by Hart on 2017, or Direct Action by Kaufman the same year, have pinpointed that contemporary folk politics is characterized for a lack of leadership, lack of strategic planning, refusal of sustained political organization, and ad hoc planning, among other features. So with all this in mind, the third question goes as follows. How would you answer to this author's claim that protests are some sort of window dressing? That in the end, unlike, for instance, the civil rights movements in the 60s and 70s, anything that achieve is to rattle a bit the system without any long-term consequences. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want me to address
yes,
these
please.
questions before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. They are all very important questions, and I think going through them in the order you posed them, first of all, I don't think that the civil society disappeared from the scene, but it disappears for sure from the media. And it disappears from the perspective of those who enter in power. But what I try to stress in my research is that you have different paths. So if we take another wave of protest I studied is the one in Southern Europe. Portugal was a case which was very different from the Spanish one. In the Spanish case, there was transición pactada, pacted transitions, and the attempt to go through compromises, which was successful in the beginning, but left very questions unanswered. You are from Chile. I think Chile is another example of transición pactada with this type of I say challenges and dark sides. Portugal with the rupture, what Barrington Moore would have described as a sort of revolutions, was instead a case in which the movements was perceived as remaining in power, the Carnation revolutions, for at least the fundamental first years after the transition. So the 1-2 years, which were nevertheless important in order to issue a constitution in which a lot of rights related with participations and social rights are particularly defended. And the effect we saw even nowadays in the crisis in 2011 and later on, the rights defended by the Portuguese revolutions were still quite relevant and produced different type of developments than in the Spanish case. Similar was the history in the Czech Republic, if compared, for instance, with Poland and so on. So there are different paths, and in some cases you have movements that are able to be present also within the institutions. In other cases, in the cases which we discovered as the most delicate, the most difficult to address, are the cases in which instead democracy conceived as representative democracies came immediately on the front stage. Soon, very quickly, election. And what the activists we interviewed claimed, both those in the Arab Spring and those in Central Eastern Europe, was that when elections come too soon, they tend to produce challenges rather than being seen as solutions, because they arrived when, as you said, there has been not yet the time for actors in the civil society to organize themselves. There is still a dialogue that elections with the majoritarian type of logic tend to interrupt. So while very often what is promoted also at the international level is institutions of representative democracy, what the activists that participated in the movements for democracy claimed for was time to develop institutions of participatory type of democracies. And also the questions on the characteristic of protest, I think, is to be differentiated. In some cases, it could be window dressing, but in other cases, what you see is a sort of stratification of constructions of a civil society. And I think this morning the vice rector said something which is important also nowadays. Democracy is a process. Which requires long time. If we think about the European context, our own democracies developed in a very long time. So through processes which have been studied at length by political scientists, which included slow increase in participations and slow development of civic rights. They pretend that in some countries, after long-lasting experience with authoritarian regimes, you can go from 1 week to the next into democratic election, and it's done, is what the activists themselves perceive as misleading. And in fact, one of the activists we interviewed in Egypt, he said intensifications of time is also the sort of, say, paradoxically a negative effect, that you have the impressions that you can change things very fast. He said, we thought that the revolutions was a moment. We thought that you could change things very quickly. He said, what we learn is that the revolution, through which he meant democratization, is a process. So more or less the words you used this morning. It requires time, it requires a lot of commitments, and taking into account also the need to develop long-lasting processes, institutions, and norms which needs to be developed.
Thank you. So, talking about time.
Yes, time.
we would like to have time for another question from a doctoral student. It's Guilherme Marques Pedro, also from Uppsala University. So please.
Thank you again for the very insightful talk. I wanted to focus more on the role of social movements and of protests in democratization. So you seem to have you did say it was going to be an optimistic talk, even though focusing on some shadows, and I want to focus on those shadows as well. Your portrayal of social movements seems to be a very optimistic one. So you speak of arenas of solidarity where people gather and meet and create memories and organize themselves around a message and representing the voiceless in some ways. But there are two, I think, rather obvious problems with this. One of them is that many of these social movements are probably many of them are not democratic at all. And then how are we to be sure that they are actually representing those that need representation? I'm thinking, for instance, about immigrants, right? So how is this democracy as process, as you referred to, as a process of forming opinions rather than just formal democracy based on elections, is to include the voices of those who cannot mobilize, they cannot be in protests. Many of them are stuck in the borders, many of them are not here yet, actually. So how are we to accommodate for the interests of those who are still yet to come? Another question that I wanted to pose to you is, you mentioned the Portuguese Revolution, the Spanish transition, and those were obviously the so-called first wave revolutions that happened during the Cold War. Now, there's a huge difference between that context and today's context. It seems to me that you said it yourself that when interviewing an activist, he said revolution as democratization. So there's one way. There's only one way that revolutions can go today, right? So are we still speaking? Is revolution still possible today at all? If you think that there were a lot of revolutions that actually were not achieved. So if you think of protests in Greece against austerity, we can speak of revolutions that failed, that never actually reached an end. So during the Cold War, obviously we can pick sides, and we would certainly probably pick the same side, but you had models, political models of democracy that you could choose, and there were times in which the Portuguese Revolution, including many people, thought was going to take the other side. And so there was choice. Today there isn't. What do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, important questions. I think she will give me 5 minutes, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. We will come back to those questions in the panels, yes, I'm sure.
So, first response is about the type of developments. We studied also the negative, the dark side, the process which failed. And there is a book which just came out which focuses on former Yugoslavia, Yemen, Libya, and Syria as cases in which movements for democratizations triggered the worst civil wars. So the destabilizations of authoritarian regimes doesn't always produce the positive outcome, and I don't have the time to address this in detail, but we have to look at the ways in which structures are still relevant, the characteristics of the military is relevant, the presence of ethnic and religious divisions is relevant, and this is important. I think that we are not in a moment in which there are no choice. So it is true that the perceptions is often that at national level you have many constraints, and you took the example of Greece, which is an example of big frustration after the expectations that with 3 electoral processes that had gone in the directions of asking for changes. Some changes would happen, and it didn't. But my impression is that we are in a moment in which the type of neoliberal consent is challenged, at least. Some scholars like Wolfgang Streeck and other things that the same capitalist type of asset could be challenged. I don't believe this, but I believe that we are in a moment in which scholars like Karl Polanyi said you tend to have always a return of counter-movement for social protections against the free market, proposing and struggling for social rights as particularly important. And I think we are in this moment, a moment in which there are strong conflicts around issues of social justice with different positions. And even if when I use the term revolutions, I don't mean any violent type of transformations and any anti-systemic type of developments, but I think that there are possibilities of turning points, critical junctures towards alternative visions, maybe since we are in Scandinavian countries, towards a social democratic type of developments, which in the last years have been challenged by other economic visions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.